All right, howdy. Well, let me say first, welcome to the last day of OpenJS and the AMP Contributor Summit. Today, I'm going to be talking about some of the challenges that we have faced on the AMP project, scaling our open source infrastructure, how we addressed some of those challenges, and some of the key takeaways that can be generalized to other infrastructure teams on other projects. Now, by way of introduction, my name is Ryan. I have been a member of the AMP Infrastructure Working Group since April of last year. I've been a software engineer at Google for about 2 years now, and I have a dog named Kitty who looks like a small wolf. Now, the way that we think about infrastructure within our working group, in no particular order, falls into three larger buckets. The first being developer experience. So making sure that the process of contributing to the OpenAMP project is of a caliber on par with that of a well-run software company. So that includes tooling to make life easier, testing to make code better, and systems that support effective collaboration. The second of these buckets is release quality, which is ensuring that the code that we serve to billions of pages worldwide every week doesn't break the web. Now, that's not just how the code gets from GitHub to an optimized binary to your browser, but it also includes how publishers and developers experience, understand, and are able to trust in that release and update process. And finally, project glue. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, when there's something that's needed by the whole AMP project, but it isn't a quote-unquote feature, so systems that support cross-team or project-wide goals often fall under the purview of the infrastructure working group. Now, to provide the ideal developer experience, we've come to rely on a lot of bots to automate critical processes for AMP developers. Now, as a side note, all of the bots I'm about to talk about could potentially be deployed for other projects. So feel free to reach out to the AMP Infrastructure Working Group for more information, or feel free to comment in the live chat. I will be taking questions and responding during the presentation. Now, the first of these bots is what we call the PR deploy bot, which simplifies the process of manually testing and verifying the changes in a PR that you might be reviewing. So the PR deploy bot was built to address a classic code review pain point, which is someone changes something and you need to look at it and make sure that it does the right thing. Now, normally this would require jumping from the GitHub UI to a terminal, running a handful of Git commands, maybe authenticating, possibly updating dependencies, and then finally actually building and running this server to check out the example pages. Meanwhile, we've already done a lot of this work within Travis, and now every PR gets an easy link for reviewers to test out, see changes in action, experiment with a component that's being changed, and so on. Very cool, very handy, especially for a project as user interface focused as AMP. Next, we're going to look at the owner's bot, which automates the process of establishing and operating on code ownership. So as our code base and developer pool expanded, the question we faced was how do we ensure that each PR gets reviewed by people who know what's important in that PR, but also each stakeholder likewise is informed about changes relevant to their component or working group. As the project and the community grew, reviews became both more important and more of a limited resource. We could no longer we no longer had just a handful of engineers who could review any PR. In addition, external collaborators couldn't request reviews until they had joined the AMP project organization through GitHub. Now, this was a GitHub restriction, but it added additional friction for external collaborators who wanted to contribute to the AMP project. And many of these external collaborators also had no way of knowing who they should involve in certain changes. So the first half of this solution was a gatekeeper for changes to the repository. Now, we describe ownership for code with owners files, which use basically a JSON format. And these owners files provide a hierarchical and pattern matching based ownership model. So for example, the ads working group owns all changes to files within the ads directory. On the flip side, the outreach working group owns changes to any markdown file anywhere in the repository. The owner's bot will only approve PRs where every file is approved by at least one owner of that file. And so this gives working groups confidence that their components will be changed safely and with the proper oversight and review. And this also allows external collaborators to take ownership, such as those who contribute new video players or ad providers, even if they aren't intimately involved in the AMP project outside of their own component. Now, the second half of the solution involved identifying the best reviewer set for a PR. So we developed an algorithm to minimize the number of reviewers needed for a PR to have full ownership coverage without overloading the high-level folks with tons of PR reviews. So for example, Malta, one of the engineers who started AMP, technically has the ability to approve any change. And so we could just assign him to review every PR, and that would, quote unquote, minimize the number of reviewers per PR, but that's obviously not the ideal outcome. So this system supports notifying teams of changes and various other notification controls. So for example, the caching working group gets notified to all changes to any files that are used to validate AMP pages, so proto-ASCII files. This allows the user interface working group to submit and change their components, but the caching working group still gets kept in the loop even though they're not necessarily blocking any PRs from being submitted. In practice, out of about 2,600 PRs that we looked at, less than 0.5% of all PRs required more than 3 reviewers using this model. Now, a quick aside on how some of these automation systems can synergize. For a long time, we've used a bot called Renovate Bot to update dependencies. And we have a rotation tasked with, among other things, reviewing and submitting these PRs. And this became a pretty heavy workload because at one point, dependency upgrades made up almost 20% of all commits. So we discovered that Renovate configuration allowed for grouping PRs by the location of the package.json file. And so this let us group those PRs into changes to validator dependencies and core dependencies and dev dependencies and so on. And thus an unexpected friendship was born. So now Renovate automatically creates these PRs based on where those package.json files live within the mono repo. And then Owner's Bot handles assigning those upgrade PRs to the relevant owners. So for example, the caching working group now automatically gets added to validator dependency updates. This wasn't particularly planned for, but it sort of emerged from the way the two bots work together. Now, the next bot in our toolchain is the bundle size bot, which helps us to monitor and limit increases to the compiled binary size. So speed is critical for AMP pages, and so by extension is the size of the JavaScript bundle. Now, each runtime or extension file can be configured to permit some relative size increases, say a tenth of a kilobyte, as well as teams that can approve increases past that threshold. Now, when changes in a PR exceed that, someone who can approve the increase is automatically added as a reviewer. Like the Owner's Bot, this allows developers to work independently and focus on their area of expertise. Most external collaborators don't even need to think or know about some of these requirements. And the larger team can trust the collective results. They can trust that we're going to stick to our project-wide goals without everyone having to focus on them individually. Now, the final bot that I'm going to mention today helps us make the AMP project easily accessible to anyone who wants to contribute. In order to be assigned issues, request reviews, or tag a working group, a user has to be a part of the AMP project organization on GitHub. Now, Anyone can join the AMP project organization, but previously this was a manual process. There was a Google form that was handled by the outreach working group. You would fill out the form, and maybe once a week, someone from the outreach working group would go through, look at the people who had recently requested to be joined, and they would manually send out invites. With the introduction of InviteBot, any member of the organization can extend invitations within an issue or a PR comment. So now macros like /invite or /tryassign make it trivial to involve a new collaborator in an issue. Again, just trying to reduce friction and make it as easy as possible for anyone to get involved and contribute to the AMP project. Now, the second major focus of the AMP working group is release quality, but what does that really entail? Well, it's more than just the quality of the code that's being released. When I think about our releases, I think about three pillars: cadence, code, and communication. In other words, when do we release? What did we release? And who knows about the release? AMP operates with an evergreen weekly release cycle. When we update, so does every single AMP page in the world. When thinking about the release cadence for something like AMP, it affects all publishers at once without them taking action or explicitly opting in. So we have to balance some conflicting goals. On one hand, this weekly cadence was too fast for some publishers that had to validate each update, because every single week they were forced to run extensive and expensive QA cycles. On the other hand, this was still too slow for some developers, because that meant that they wouldn't find out how their component was being received or if something was broken for up to a week. Now, it used to take a week for a change to reach beta or experimental release channels. And when errors were found, it was tricky to bisect a whole week of PRs to try and figure out what introduced it. And then fixing that error with a cherry pick is always going to be very risky. And this is why in the beginning of this year, we introduced a nightly release channel. The nightly release channel is built and released every weeknight. So we get data right away on if something is broken, if there's some kind of errors. We can react to error reports before those errors even reach the beta release. And publishers can opt into this nightly channel and preview the impact of upcoming changes, again, before they're even released to the general public. On the opposite end of the spectrum, larger publishers with QA cycles wanted slower release cycles and a more stable release. So we had to balance this with the desire to maintain our evergreen release system and our high development velocity. Slowing releases means it would take more time for developers to get data on their features. It means it would take more time to fix bugs. At the beginning of this year, we also introduced LTS, or long-term stable releases. With LTS releases, publishers can opt in at a page level by slightly adjusting the way they include the runtime and extension scripts. The LTS release sort of pins one stable release each month to the LTS release channel. Publishers still get the same regular updates to the release. They still get the same cache benefits as any other AMP page, but there's a little bit less of a fear of a breaking change being introduced because the LTS release channel is a little bit more tried and tested. Next, the most obvious component of release quality is going to be what's the actual code that's being released. And this was one of the most common questions we got on the infrastructure working group. Either, is our feature live yet? Or just, how do I know if my PR is in a release? And this became more and more challenging to answer as more and more release channels were introduced. This is why we tried to bring those answers directly to the AMP developers in the interface they're already familiar with, GitHub. We hooked into the systems that we use to update the active release on a given release channel. And when a release goes out, we now add labels to all the PRs included in that release. I'll make a note that we chose to use labels here instead of commenting on those PRs like some bots do, in order to avoid creating tons of notifications for people who may have been reviewers or commented on different PRs. Now, as a PR goes through the life cycle from beta, promoted to stable, promoted to LTS, that label on the PRs gets updated. We also iterated on the way that we generate our changelog. So new releases are now automatically tagged and published on GitHub, and the description for each release shows all of the PR updates grouped by the AMP components that they touch. So in this case, the solution wasn't building a tool that would answer developers' questions. The solution was embedding the answers directly into the workflow developers are already comfortable with, again, providing that information while reducing the friction to getting it. Now, that's not to say that we didn't need tools to help developers understand releases more generally. As more releases have been added, it became much more difficult to follow what's getting deployed and promoted when. And this was made even more complex by the many different channels of communications these discussions could happen on, including Slack, different GitHub threads, maybe private chat threads between the engineers who are triaging an issue. So we addressed this by pouring a significant amount of time and energy into documentation and related tools. So we started this by getting rid of some of the really heavily overloaded terms that we were using. We were referring to certain releases as canary and production, and this could get a little bit confusing in more technical conversations. This worked fine when there was only those two release channels, but as we introduced more, it just became unmanageable. We wanted clearer names that were more conventional in an open source world. So production became stable, RC or release candidate became beta, and canary became experimental. We also completely rewrote our release schedule documentation to reflect the new release channel names, the new nightly and LTS release channels, as well as the way that releases get promoted from nightly to beta to stable to LTS. We then developed visual tools to help developers follow the release process. One interactive visualization lets you explore submitting code on different days of the week and shows you when that code will reach each release channel in the weeks that follow. Another tool displays an actual weekly or monthly calendar showing the releases served on each channel within that calendar. Having these central sources of truth and intuitive ways of explaining our releases and our release process allows developers to reason more clearly about the timing of their features and their bug fixes. Now, the final category of infrastructure priorities comes down to the quote-unquote project glue, the glue that holds the project and the team together. So as I mentioned, this is work that benefits the whole project but doesn't really belong to any particular feature or working group. So as the infrastructure working group, we maintain the systems that allow all working groups and developers to work together towards a common goal. A few ways this has manifested in the past year include our new performance continuous integration tests. In order to improve performance across devices and browsers, including low-end devices, we introduce performance tests on every commit that gets merged to master. And this is supportive of a team-wide effort to make every part of AMP better and faster. We provided a powerful user interface for opting into different release channels or even specific releases. And this provided both an avenue for developers throughout the project to reproduce and bisect issues, as well as for publishers to try and identify when something on their page might have broken and back up and try and see if they can identify what the cause was. We also introduced some monitoring systems which detect new errors reported by pages in the wild, and it then uses the stack trace from those errors to identify related PRs that change the lines in that stack trace and their authors. This provides a process by which an error that occurs, which is not objectively owned by any working group, can easily be assigned and triaged. Finally, even just providing comprehensive issue templates, such as for things like cherry picks and error reports, helps AMP developers collaborate efficiently. It minimizes ambiguity and provides a shared toolkit we can all be familiar with, because no matter who created this cherry pick template, if I'm the release on duty rotation, I can look at that cherry pick template and I know where to look for the information that's important for the processes that I'm in charge of. Overall, our hope is that by bringing the problems closer to our developers, we can also help bring the developers and the working groups closer to each other and solve problems as a team rather than just a collection of individual contributors. To close this out, if there's just one thing you walk away from this talk with, it's this. What you don't do in infrastructure is just as important as what you do. Everything in the realm of infrastructure is quote unquote important. There's always room for improvement. Something is always deprecated. Something is always inconsistent throughout the project. Some new tool or feature would be helpful and might make developers' lives easier. All these things are all true at the same time, always for just about every project. So when you're thinking about infrastructure, identifying your priorities is essential. For every decision, you have to think about what will the impact be on developers? Is this something that's broken? Or is this something shiny and new that would just be helpful? How much time will it save? Equally, or more important, how many mistakes can it prevent? Sometimes documentation and communication go farther than code. Sometimes technical problems have human solutions. And of course, when they don't, hire the robots. Thank you all for listening in. I want to extend my gratitude to all of the attendees here, to all of the volunteers helping make this event possible, and to the OpenJS Foundation for bringing us all together under one virtual roof to share knowledge and have these discussions. At the same time, I'd like to offer my condolences and support to all of the families impacted, both physically and economically, by the coronavirus pandemic, as well as to the communities of color impacted every day by the systemic racism we've seen highlighted in recent weeks. Black Lives Matter.